thank you all so much for being here tonight. We're here to talk about John Lewis and the biography by you, Mr. David Greenberg.
That's right.
I did not know that you were from Newton. I should have, of all
Proud
the things.
Newton native.
I was so excited to dive into this book. I overlooked that huge piece of information. Wow. And so, man, yeah, well, let's talk about this book. First, I feel like let's hear from the man. Let's hear from John Lewis. We're going to play a clip from his speech on the March in Washington, from the March in Washington in 1963.
I appeal to all of you to get in this great revolution that is sweeping this nation. Get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village and hamlet of this nation until true freedom comes, until the revolution of 1776 is complete. We must get in this revolution and complete the revolution. For in the Delta of Mississippi, in Southwest Georgia, in the Black Belt of Alabama, in Harlem, in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and all over this nation, the black masses on the march for jobs and freedom.
I'm looking at Baird Rustin in the background.
Right.
It's like running quarterback, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. How does that clip hit your ears now that you finished the book and you've spent so much time with his life? Like, how does that hit your ears right now in this moment?
Well, I mean, what I find amazing after studying John Lewis now for 5, in some ways more years, and you see the young John Lewis. You can see the older John Lewis in the young John Lewis, and you can see the young John Lewis and the older John Lewis.
Yeah.
He went through a lot of changes in his life, going from, dirt poor poverty in rural Alabama to this young, precocious hero of the civil rights movement to U.S. Congress. But all the way through, you see this combination of, on the one hand, kind of steely, resolute conviction.
Mm-hmm.
He had a moral sense of what was right, and he was going to pursue it and pursue it fearlessly. But he also believed in politics. And, you see this not only in his political career, but even, with his speech, the March on Washington. There's a story I'll just tell quickly. I can't do justice to it all, which is laid out in the book. But, the March on Washington was conceived before John F. Kennedy had introduced the 1963, what was later the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so it was designed to put pressure on Congress and the administration to finally get moving on the civil rights bill. Well, by the time it finally came together, Kennedy had gotten out in front and introduced a bill. And a lot of people who were involved in organizing the march, Bayard Rustin, who you mentioned, Martin Luther King, A. Philip Randolph, the great labor leader. I just came into Back Bay Station. I see there's a whole statue and tribute to A. Philip Randolph, a name who should be better remembered today. Mm-hmm. Anyway, they all kind of want to now make the march. Let's get everybody behind this very important, soon-to-be historic bill. But John Lewis is the new chairman at just age 23 of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is only a few years old. They're of a bit more radical cast, and they see a lot of problems with this bill. It doesn't really address voting rights. It doesn't really address police brutality, a series of other things.
He wasn't too happy with it.
So he drafts, along with some of his SNCC friends, this pretty militant, critical speech.
Yeah.
And the day before,
Wait,
yeah, go ahead.
I'm going to ask you about that. I'm going to ask you about that. You're skipping ahead.
All right,
we're going to get to that. But I really want to know about you in this book, right? Because this is nearly 600 pages about John Lewis. I mean, you got in the nooks and crannies of everything.
Yeah.
I would love to know, why John Lewis? What was your relationship to John Lewis and his legacy before you started writing this book?
Yeah. Well, I obviously didn't know him. I knew of him, for my generation. He was someone who came to sort of political prominence as a congressman, just as I was kind of reaching adulthood and following politics. But, his story was somewhat well known. I mean, the heroism at Selma, March on Washington. And then kind of over the years, partly through longevity and partly just through his continued outspoken assertiveness, he was kind of evolving into this iconic figure.
Yeah.
He published a memoir. He published these graphic memoirs for kids, the March trilogy, one of which won the National Book Award. And so I'd seen him sort of emerge into this, beloved and revered figure, but there was no biography of him. And I thought he deserved one. I'll also say that as a historian, I've written a lot about American politics in the 20th century. I'd never written a book in which race and the struggle for racial equality was really at the center of the story. And I think most historians would tell you it is at the center of the American story. It's certainly at least one of the key central themes. So I felt this was something I wanted to take on and think about and to try to do through the life of John Lewis.
Yeah. So as you did that, right, with race being at the center of this story, you're a white man, right? How did you check yourself in writing this book? Because you hit on a lot of some deep racial issues in this book.
Right. Well, in any biographical effort, in any historical effort, the whole point is you have to understand people who are different from you. I could write a biography of Napoleon, and I'm not a short 19th century French general. So you go to the sources. I read everything John Lewis wrote. I read every interview with him I could find, watched video, listened to his speeches. I interviewed hundreds of people who knew him, white and black, getting their perspective, making sure that I wasn't, bringing biases or viewpoints that are blind spots to the question. What am I missing? What don't I understand? You're always asking that. Black colleagues and friends who are historians and biographers would read the work, talk to me about it. What am I missing? What am I not understanding? Because I was very much aware that not just between people of different races, I'm not a Southerner, I'm not a Christian. There's lots of ways in which I am different from him. But I think John Lewis also stood for the principle, if anybody stood for the principle that ultimately we're all human. He would say we're all God's children.
I get the feeling I think he would have got a kick out of you writing a book about it.
Yeah. No, I met with him at the start of it, and he gave me his blessing to write it, and his chief of staff, a guy named Michael Collins, who's also from the Boston area, ended up going to Morehouse College and then getting involved in, Atlanta politics and John Lewis. But I think from Boston area originally. Anyway, they were very supportive because I think, whatever racial differences exist or differences of region or religion, there was a sort of shared understanding of John Lewis's importance and contribution. Now, some of that, my thinking about that changed and evolved as I did the research. He actually became a more complicated, intriguing, interesting person to me.
Yeah.
I was sort of worried at first. One friend of mine said, you don't want to write the life of St. Francis. Hagiography is what we call it, which literally means the life of a saint. And one, that's not interesting to anybody. But two, even though John Lewis was a saintly person, he was a human. He was not a saint.
Absolutely.
And I wanted to understand him with all his shortcomings, the mistakes he made, the friends he disappointed, as well as all the historic things he achieved.
What was the hardest thing for you to wrap your head around?
Well, that's interesting. There were a lot of things that surprised me. Some were kind of pleasant or interesting surprises, maybe not hard to wrap my head around. For example, turns out he's a tremendous collector of art, of African-American art. His home was filled with amazing artwork. He got to know Romare Bearden and Jacob Lawrence and some of the leading Black artists of our times. He also got to know what were called folk artists. I think that term is still somewhat used, Black artists in the countryside without formal training in art, yet who produced some magnificent works. And he kind of collected this stuff before it was a thing to do. So there were kind of those sides of him. Maybe the hardest part, I mean, I'm trying to think about your question, was coming to think about his personal life, his marriage, his relationship with his son. Mm-hmm. When I began the book, I thought, I'm just going to write the public man. He's been a public figure kind of his whole life. He gets involved with the sit-in movement in Nashville at age 20. And I found a press conference he's having with Martin Luther King and James Farmer at age 21, a profile in the New York Times, age 21. So he's a public figure his whole life. And I thought, I can do the public man, and I'm not going to get into his psychology or his personal life.
Yeah.
But as I researched it, I found I couldn't separate the two.
Got to get messy.
Yeah. And in part because his wife, Lillian, who is an incredibly private person and about whom almost nothing had been written, turned out to be such an important part of the story. Mm-hmm. And so I ended up talking to her friends and her colleagues and getting to know who she was and the role she played.
She passed in 2012?
In 2012, that's right. They married in 1968, so they had a marriage of many decades that really kind of coincided with his turn to politics and his pursuit of a political career. And I mean, we can talk about that more later, but she really, I came to see, played an important role in creating the John Lewis we know today.
Yeah. And I just want to remind folks, we will be taking questions from the audience throughout this interview. So feel free to head on to Slido.com and hit hashtag Greenberg, enter your questions there.
We're going to put that on Twitter.
Yeah. We're going to, have your questions sent up here, whatever, as long as they're good questions. Don't ask what his favorite flavor of ice cream is. We're not gonna. What is your favorite flavor of ice cream?
Well, there was, when John Lewis died, someone did a Good Trouble Crunch or something like that. They did a Good Trouble flavored ice cream in tribute. So I don't know.
So thank you for that.
Yeah.
So you actually, in this book, you interviewed 275 people, and you interviewed the man himself. Were you starstruck?
Yeah, I have to say I was a little starstruck.
Take us through that day. What was that like?
So, I mean, it had taken me months to get this interview, and I was just trying every angle.
And it's so good when you get that interview scheduled. Oh,
and
it's the best.
Finally, I'm not quite sure how this happened, but Michael Collins, who was his chief of staff, said to me at one point, he's like, yeah, when Ethel Kennedy called on your behalf, we knew you were serious. I have to say, I don't know Ethel Kennedy, but I think I know who told her to call on
that
my
Massachusetts
behalf.
connection.
Yeah, exactly. So I finally, they said, okay, come down on Friday, to Atlanta, to the district office. And Monday comes, no details. Tuesday, no details. I'm emailing, no response. So finally I say, I've booked a flight. I'm coming on Friday afternoon. And they're like, oh, yeah, you're fine. Friday, 4 o'clock. The week before, John Lewis had done the coin toss at the Super Bowl in Atlanta.
Oof.
The next day, he's going to the Oscars to introduce one of the Best Picture nominees, Green Book. So this is like peak John Lewis. I'm wedged in at Friday, 4 o'clock for a few minutes. You go into his office. It's like a museum, a shrine. I don't know. Every inch of shelf space is a plaque, a trophy, campaign memorabilia, historic photographs all over the room. So, yeah, it's hard not to be a little starstruck. But John Lewis is the most self-effacing person I've ever met, perhaps. I mean, puts on no airs. You know, people told me stories. You know, the maintenance guy would come to fix the light bulb in his congressional office. John Lewis is like holding the ladder. You know, one chief of staff said they were going to meet the speaker. They're late to meet the speaker of the House, and the security guard at the Cannon building, the office building, stops him and wants to tell him something about the security guard's son. The chief of staff is looking at his watch. He's tugging on Lewis's sleeve. And he says, you know, now, Rob, the speaker can wait. I mean, he really saw this security guard as just as important as the Speaker of the House. And I think he really, again, like the common humanity in all of us, whether it's race or class or station, you know, that's just how he saw people. And so I think he puts you at ease. You're starstruck, but you're also at ease because, you know, he's just I mean, since publishing this book, one friend of mine told me a story. Oh, yeah, one time I was at Comic-Con with someone. I didn't know any of these superhero and comic book people, but then I saw John Lewis, and I went to say something, and he said, sit down. And he ended up, like, talking to him for an hour. Like, that's just who John Lewis was. So, yes, you're starstruck, but you also are put at ease.
Yeah, he gives you a story to tell.
Absolutely, every time. And everyone who's met him has a John Lewis story, you know, like this. You know, one of his constituents, oh, yeah, I would see him every year, Thanksgiving, Black Friday. He'd be at the Panda Express at the Lenox Mall, like hang out. He'd love to go to Nordstrom's and buy sweaters. And like, it was just, there was this very relatable side of John Lewis for all his superstardom.
I love that. I love that. Well, I want to continue getting into the man who John Lewis is, and I want to go to a clip. I'm going to go back to a clip of his speech from the March on Washington in 1963, and I want to talk about this a little bit.
Okay.
We do not want our freedom gradually, but we want to be free now. We are tired. We are tired of being beaten by policemen. We're tired of seeing our people locked up in jail over and over again. And then you holler, be patient. How long can we be patient? We want our freedom, and we want it now.
The man was tired.
Right.
He's tired of messing around. And, you know, you write that was the most radical speech of the day.
Right.
Talk to us about that, because there was some back and forth, and he almost didn't give the speech.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So I had sort of given people the start of the story. He and people at SNCC have drafted this pretty radical speech, pretty hard hitting against.
We're going to march
Kennedy
through the
bill.
South like Sherman.
Right. So one line, which John Lewis doesn't write, we're going to march through the South the way Sherman did. You know, Sherman's March to the Sea, where they just destroyed farms and, you know, all this, everything lay waste during the Civil War. And of course, Lewis, that's not really him. So he adds, you know, to the end of the sentence, the word nonviolently, which kind of renders it somewhat confusing or meaningless. But there's a number of lines like that. And it's actually first the Archbishop of Washington, who's supposed to give the benediction the next day, who sees the advanced text. He objects to certain things, you know, partly criticizing the call for patience. You know, he says, we're tired, we want it now. So there's this criticism of patience and patience.
Something about the Catholic Church.
It's a Catholic doctrine, you know, it's important. And it's funny because later in life, Lewis would talk about, he didn't necessarily use the word patience, but he understood that sometimes you lose a battle and you have to fight another day, and counseling younger people, his staff, to, you know, persevere. But there were all kinds of people. The Kennedy people had objections. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP had things he didn't like.
I'm thinking of A. Philip Randolph. Even I use the black mass.
Right. So somebody objects to the phrase "the masses." Sounds too communistic. And Philip Randolph, who's staunchly anti-communist but a socialist labor organizer, says, like, I've used the phrase "the black masses." There's nothing wrong with it. And the word revolution, which, as you heard Lewis changes to put in the context of the revolution of 1776, saying, come on, we all believe in revolution. Like, that shouldn't be a dirty word. So in the Lincoln Memorial itself, in the shadow of that colossal Daniel Chester French Lincoln statue, they're having these intense negotiations, sentence by sentence, what has to come out, what can be changed. Somebody has a little Underwood typewriter. They're sort of rewriting the speech. And Lewis, he's a young guy. He has this very pronounced rural Alabama accent and a bit of a speech impediment. Like he struggles with public speaking, even though he's been a leader now for a few years. But he's practiced the old version. So one friend who was there said, yeah, as they were rewriting it, he just was standing over their shoulder saying, don't change too much, don't change too much, because he'd practiced it. And the speech you heard, he's really delivering for the first time. But what I think is actually remarkable is for all the concessions he makes, and King says about that Sherman line, he says, John, that doesn't sound like you. And it wasn't. He didn't write it. And so that came out. But for all that came out and was altered, it was still a critical speech. And he found a way, and I think this is something he does a lot in his life and career, to be accommodating. He didn't want to rain on the parade. The thing was shaping up as this great victory and triumphal moment for the movement. And a sour note a discordant note could have undermined it. So he doesn't want that to happen, but he still wants to deliver this criticism. And I think the final speech actually does that quite deftly. Like it does both. And in the end, I think it's a tribute to Lewis and his willingness to kind of compromise a little, but not too much. And I think, again, as you see this in his political career, it's a challenge all politicians face. When do you compromise? When does that mean sacrificing principle? And can you still hold on to your core principles while still being accommodating to a reasonable degree? And I think you see kind of the early seeds of the politician John Lewis in that story about the speech.
John Lewis is talking about freedom in that speech. He wants his freedom now. We want our freedom now. What is freedom to John Lewis?
Well, freedom has a lot of dimensions.
To John Lewis.
Right. To John Lewis, I mean, first and foremost, it is, freedom for Black people to enjoy all the same rights and privileges that white people in the South enjoy, whether that's sitting at a lunch counter, going to a swimming pool, walking down the street hand in hand with a person of a different race, all kinds of civil rights, political rights, voting rights. This is all part of it. There's also an economic dimension to it. Initially, when it was Philip Randolph and Bayard Rustin who had first conceived the March on Washington, it was going to be for jobs. The argument was, we're making progress on the fight for rights and integration. Now we need to turn to jobs. I mean, it was a little premature because we hadn't passed the Civil Rights Act yet. King gets involved, and King is the one who wants to emphasize freedom because his whole message is about freedom, emancipation, kind of making good on the promise of Reconstruction of the end of the Civil War, of emancipation. And so it becomes the march for jobs and freedom. But there's definitely an economic component of freedom too. Yeah. That is, if you're free with political rights, but not with economic rights, and not with economic equality, that too can be a form of unfreedom, a form of restriction.
And forgive me if I'm trying to remember the timeline here. The freedom budget, was that created before or after the Civil Rights Act passed?
That's I believe it's 1966.
Okay.
That Randolph introduces this idea of a freedom budget. Other people talked about a Marshall Plan for the cities.
That was supposed to kind of fill in the gaps left open by the Civil Rights Act.
Right. Yeah. So we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. But, the fight for civil rights, for integration, for political equality. Then the next year, 65, is the big fight for voting rights. And then there is the question of where does the movement go from here after these two historic accomplishments? And there's the turn to these economic issues.
Yeah.
Jobs, schooling, healthcare, all these things that we still grapple with today, with inequities today. And Philip Randolph talks about a freedom budget, a massive government investment in all of these areas to help bring about, racial equality, but also to help the white poor and the poor and the working class of other races too. I mean,
Because poverty was the target.
right, exactly. I mean, and Randolph, again, socialist. Rustin was sort of his protege. They kind of saw it in these class terms. They saw, of course, the racial inequalities, but they also saw a strong class dimension to their analysis as well.
Thank you for that. We did get a little ahead, but thank you.
All
I
right.
appreciate that because I want to kind of go back. I want to go back because we just watched that speech.
Right.
He was in his 20s there. You talked about some of the work he's done on the speech and stuff. But I want to go back to like the early beginnings because we even have a question here asking how much racism did Lewis experience growing up, and we're about to get into that.
Yeah.
You write on page 10, for anybody, write this down. So on page 10, another recreation was going into Troy. John Lewis was from Troy, Alabama. Another recreation was going into Troy on Saturdays to window shop or see a movie. John enjoyed watching Superman, The Lone Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy, and Tarzan, during which he and his siblings would cheer for the African tribesmen. But at an early age, John realized that he and his family had to sit in the balcony because the theater was segregated. He felt humiliated. And in parentheses, you put, I don't go to many movies today because of that. I'm gonna repeat that. I don't go to many movies today because of that. He said decades later.
Yeah, I think it was 1996 or something.
Yeah.
He said that. Yeah.
So was that like 50 years, 50,
Yeah.
40, 50
Right.
years later?
30. Yeah.
It's a shame. And then out of parentheses, tell us, so,
Right.
yeah, tell us more about how these moments in his youth shaped that man that we saw on stage, shaped that man who would become Congressman John Lewis.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one reason, Southerners like King and Lewis sort of put the emphasis on freedom, whereas Northerners like Rustin and Randolph were sort of more focused on questions like jobs, was the experience of Jim Crow segregation, what I would call white supremacism in the South. And, these days there's a lot of, I think, useful corrective scholarship that reminds us, look, it wasn't just the South. There was plenty of racism and in the North, and New Jersey had slavery until
Racism is deep.
1840, whatever it was, not too many years before the Civil War. But one thing I recognized doing this book is there was still, in some ways, the North and the South were fundamentally different societies.
Yeah.
And in the South, especially Alabama, I mean, Alabama and Mississippi were kind of the worst, we could say. The segregation that he experienced, you told the movie theater, but it was everywhere. He would go to get an ice cream at Bird's drugstore. The white kids could have their ice cream inside the store. The black kids had to take it outside. Lewis was a voracious reader as a child, loved to read. He wants to get a library card so he can check out books from the library in Troy, Alabama. He tries. No, he's not allowed because of the color of his skin. So he encountered these kinds of humiliations. He came to this understanding of just the wrongness, the injustice, the evil of segregation at a very personal level at a young age. Now, of course, his brothers and sisters, his parents encountered this too, but he was different. He felt a need, a mission to do something about it, to tear that system down.
Yeah.
So for him, that system of segregation, which, was not just, it's separate, it wasn't separate but equal. He knew, his black high school that he went to had these terrible buses that would break down, get stuck in the mud. He might come home, at 10 o'clock at night because of it. And, the white kids had nice schools and nice buses. So he saw the way that segregation actually also affected the education you got and so many other things.
But, and the interesting part about what you're saying is, he experienced these he was very young, but like later in his childhood, but like.
Right. Young teenager.
Yeah. But before that, when he was a young kid, he used to protest, right? Because he used to love his chickens. He used to preach to his chickens because he was into the church. That was his choir. That was his congregation. And
his flock, I say.
His flock, right, perfect.
Right.
And whenever, whenever they had to kill a chicken to eat it, he would protest nonviolently, right? I love that because the protest was already in him, and that segregation gave him a place to focus it.
Yeah. I mean, he had a defiant, stubborn streak as a child and even as a young adult,
right? Yeah.
And, it's kind of a question of where does that, become a good trait versus a not so good trait.
We're going to get into that.
Yeah. And, there were times, I think, especially in the early years of the movement, where some of his colleagues and friends found him to be a bit moralistic and so on. But it was that defiance that sort of fueled this, that, again, where his brothers and sisters might not, he just did not want to work on the farm. I mean, his parents worked extremely hard. They were sharecroppers, but they scraped together enough money to buy their own land, which was something for, a black couple with 10 children in rural Alabama. But they, to own the land and pay off their debts, they worked hard. And Lewis hated the farm work, and he just felt there's got to be a better life. And, I mentioned he loved reading, he loved school. A lot of kids find ways to skip school, trick their parents and hide and skip school. Lewis did the opposite. They would want him to stay home and pick cotton or pull corn. He would hide under the porch of the house with his book bag. The bus would pull up. He would dart onto the bus as he would go to school. So he didn't have to do the farm work, and he could instead go to school, where he'd go to the library and read the African-American newspapers and read, biographies of great black Americans. And so, yeah, for him, there was that defiance, which I think you see early on that, comes to fruition when he hooks up with the movement in college, which is in Nashville.
I want to go to a question that someone had asked, kind of fast forwarding a bit. How did he meet Martin Luther King?
Okay. Well, this is actually from this period in his life too. I mean, he first discovers King on the radio. The family listens to a Montgomery, Alabama station that plays a lot of music, but on Sunday will carry sermons. And this is, I guess, just before King really rises to national prominence with the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. And he hears King giving a sermon, and he's just riveted. And he's taken with this kind of fusion, because he's I say he's a reader. His first book that he loved was the Bible. He wants to be a minister. He actually becomes a boy minister, ordained as a teenager. So he's drawn to kind of this social gospel teaching of King, but it's fused to a whole critique of segregation and of the regime of Jim Crow in the South. And he understands immediately this is what he wants to give his life to, this kind of belief system and message and cause. So after his first year, so he goes to college at a little Bible college in Nashville called American Baptist Theological Seminary. Basically, his mother, who besides working on the farm, also has to take in extra work as a washwoman, a domestic. She's working in, it's described differently in different sources, but either an orphanage or some institution, and finds just this brochure. And, it's for American Baptist. He writes away to apply. I actually got a hold of his college acceptance letter, which says, "We hope it is in God's plan for you to come and study with us." I don't know about you, I never got such a welcome letter from any college or graduate school. And so he goes off to Nashville, and he has a lot of great, interesting experiences there, but he's kind of homesick and decides he really wants to go to school near home at Troy State. Well, Troy State is all white, but he's read about students who are challenging, whether it's University of Georgia, other, segregated schools, and getting their way in. So who does he write to? Martin Luther King. Well, who can help me do this? And to his surprise, he hears back, not at first directly from King. He hears from Ralph Abernathy, who was King's lieutenant, and Fred Gray, the attorney they worked with. They invite him to Montgomery. He's ushered in to Ebenezer Church, into King's sort of office down in the basement. And there he is. I mean, talk about starstruck. 18-year-old, 19-year-old John Lewis in the presence of Martin Luther King. And he always would tell this story. He said, "My name is John Robert Lewis." And he could never remember why he said his middle name, but he did. And, they're impressed with his courage, this unassuming kid who wants to take on Troy State. And they lay out for him what's involved. But it requires his parents' cooperation, because he's 21 in Alabama. He's under 21. You need your parents' cooperation for a lawsuit. And King explains to him, your parents may not want to do this. There could be retaliation. There could be violence. They could have their credit threatened. Lots of terrible things were known to happen to people who stood up to the system. Lewis remains steadfast, but he goes then back to the farm. And when he starts telling his parents about it, he can just see it's not happening.
Yeah.
This becomes famous later in life. He uses this good trouble slogan. They don't like to get into trouble. I mean, again, I think they probably hated segregation as much as he did, but their way of getting along had been just provide as well as you can for your family, trust in the church, trust and make a good life despite these oppressions. And they were not going to help him challenge. So he goes back that fall to Nashville. But, if you're a believer, maybe it is in God's plan, because that's when things really start heating up in Nashville with a group of ministers, very much allies of King and in the King style, who start up the big quest for a Montgomery bus boycott style project in Nashville that Lewis becomes a central part of. And that's the lunch counter sit-ins.
Yeah. And Lewis was so committed to nonviolence. And he was all about, one thing I remember in the book, him saying, not only do you not have to, you can't hit them back, you can't want to.
Right.
You're not supposed to. He was, and show us a picture from Selma. There's not a lot of people who would tolerate that.
Right.
And I think that demonstrates just how much he believed in it. And he was so committed to it that he didn't have relationships and stuff,
Right.
And to turn that around, he ended up getting married in 1968.
Right.
Because during that time, he was just look, I'm committed to this movement. But he met Lillian Miles, and that changed. I know I'm skipping ahead a bit,
Right.
but I do want to get into, because we all know what happened at Selma, right? Let's be honest. We know what happened at Selma. This is the moment that made John Lewis John Lewis. We know John Lewis because this is the sacrifice he made for voting rights. But I want to ask about John Lewis on a more personal note and learn about who he was as a husband, who he was as a father. He had a son. He and Lillian Miles had a son named John Miles. I would love to know more about what it was like with John Lewis at home.
Yeah. Well, let me first just say one word about the nonviolence that you mentioned, this depth of commitment.
Yeah.
because one person after another, both whom I interviewed and also like in interviews that I found in archives, said that, many of us believed in the teachings. It was a kind of fusion of Christian teachings, but also Gandhian nonviolence. And many of these ministers studied in India. And James Lawson, who was a divinity student at Vanderbilt in the early 60s, was kind of one of the leaders who led them in workshops and study groups, so that when it came time for the sit-ins, they knew their Gandhi, they knew Thoreau and civil disobedience, but they also had practiced, spitting on each other, putting cigarettes down each other. So part of it was that he was trained for this. But Lawson told me, and I had the chance to interview him, he died this past summer at 94. But when I spoke to him, he said, when I met John Lewis, he was already ripe. Yeah. In other words, he came to these Gandhian teachings, but it was he already knew it in a sense. You know what I mean? Like it was already
He hated
in
guns.
him. So, and everybody said, of all the people who were committed, he was the most committed. And it does, I as I said earlier, he was saintly, but not a saint. But this is the quality in him that seems to me the most hard to access, the most saintly or divine or, unnatural. I mean, how many of us, as you said, would take those beatings and not fight back?
Right.
But to go ahead to the personal side and his family side.
Yeah, let's get in his business.
Yeah. He's an interesting mix because he always had many friends, people who loved him, people who supported him. There's something very lovable about John Lewis. Like he has these endearing qualities. People would talk about, like, even as a young man, he wasn't a very good dancer, but he loved to get out on the dance floor and bust a move. And many people remember, like, later in life, he did this video that went viral on The Office of dancing to Happy, Pharrell Williams' Happy, and it kind of became this internet sensation. And you kind of just got to love that side of him. And yet there was this intense privacy to him, too. And I think, he didn't have serious girlfriends, people he was close to. And I mean, he says, kind of a little cringy in his autobiography, he states for the record that he wasn't a virgin when he got married.
I got laid.
Like, too much information, but whatever. I'm the biographer. I guess I should know as much as I can know. But Lillian comes along at a time in his life when he's probably at his all-time low. He has left SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which he had chaired for 3 years. And in 1966, there's this kind of notorious split where...
We're going to talk about that.
Right, we'll talk about that. But he leaves the movement, and he kind of bounces around for a couple of years, decides in 68 to sign up with Robert F. Kennedy, who's running for president. And Lewis is fiercely opposed to the Vietnam War, yet he also doesn't think Eugene McCarthy is quite presidential timber. So when Bobby Kennedy gets in the race, Lewis is excited, signs up. He's with Bobby Kennedy in Indianapolis on April 4th, 1968. This is the night that Martin Luther King is assassinated. And Bobby Kennedy gives this famous spontaneous speech to an audience of mostly black Indianans who have gathered for a campaign rally, and tries to give them some hope, some comfort, keep them from getting angry and violent. Violence breaks out in many cities that night. And Lewis is there. And Bobby Kennedy says to John Lewis, of all of us kind of here on the campaign, you knew him best. You're grieving most of all. Then 2 months later, June 4th, 1968, he's in a suite in the Ambassador Hotel when downstairs, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. And Lewis has kind of transferred his hopes from King to RFK as, maybe he'll be the one to help kind of restore this country. Late 60s, there's been all this violence and division. And so that summer, he's depressed, he's exhausted, he checks into the hospital, And he's just begun dating this woman, Lillian Miles, who comes from a middle-class black family in Los Angeles. She's very cultured. She's working as a librarian at one of the universities in Atlanta. I'm not sure she has this job yet, but this is the career path she's on. And she's there every day for him, bringing him his mail, bringing him his newspaper. And very unromantically, he proposes from his hospital bed that they get married. They're married later that year.
Why was he in the hospital?
Kind of just for depression, exhaustion. It's not 100% clear from the sources, but he's just been through so much.
Yeah.
And, one thing we're talking about backstage, Lewis throughout his whole life worked incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Like just relentless. And I found these memos in the SNCC papers, several of them in different years, where some SNCC staffer would write to like the executive committee, we need to give John Lewis a rest. He's exhausted. He's been traveling for too many days. He needs an assistant. He needs help. Like, he just would push himself. And he did this too in other jobs, like when he worked at the Voter Education Project, registering people to vote. Even as a congressman, just kept up this ferocious travel schedule.
Yeah.
So he just kind of would exhaust himself. And I think exhaustion, depression, he's just at a low. Without the civil rights movement, without King, without hope for politics, Richard Nixon's about to get elected. He doesn't really know where to turn. And so Lillian coming along at this moment is just critical.
Yeah.
I mean, she not only gives him, a partner in life, a wife and someone, to share his life with, but she also has a great conviction in his capacity to do great things.
Yeah.
And she does not believe his best days are behind him. Lewis, he believes in politics, but he still thinks of himself as just this kid from the farm. He doesn't have heirs, and he doesn't imagine himself being the one to run for office.
Yeah.
He thinks his friends, he knows other friends in the movement who could do that. And Lillian helps him believe in himself.
Okay, you mentioned him getting into office. But before that, because that's a decision of somebody who believes in the establishment, right? John Lewis believed in politics, like we're talking, right? That's a philosophy of the movement, right? There are some folks who say, this is politics, we should get involved, but there's some who say politics ain't for us.
Right.
And at this point, I want to play a clip from Lewis's former SNCC colleague, Stokely Carmichael, who succeeded him in his SNCC chairmanship after that devastating voting session.
Right.
That helped send him into a depression. So this is a clip to introduce you all to Stokely Carmichael from the Black Power speech that he gave in 1966 at UC Berkeley.
Now, several people have been upset because we said that integration was irrelevant when initiated by blacks, and that in fact it was a subterfuge, an insidious subterfuge for the maintenance of white supremacy. Now, we maintain that in the past 6 years or so, this country has been feeding us a thalidomide drug of integration, and that some Negroes have been walking down a dream street talking about sitting next to white people, and that does not begin to solve the problem. That when we went to Mississippi, we did not go to sit next to Ross Barnett. We did not go to sit next to Jim Clark. We went to get them out of our way. And that people ought to understand that we were never fighting for the right to integrate. We were fighting against white supremacy.
So that's Stokely Carmichael. And obviously, there are two radically different approaches to the fight. Yet, there was a lot of respect between Carmichael and Lewis, and even Carmichael and King. Talk about the relationship between Lewis and Stokely Carmichael, who would later become Kwame Ture, and the change that Carmichael brought to SNCC and how that challenged Lewis.
Right. So, Stokely Carmichael he's originally from Trinidad, but he's from New York. He goes to the Bronx High School of Science, where actually my daughter goes. It's, an integrated school, really high quality public school. So his background is very different from John Lewis's. He grows up not with segregation, but with other forms of racial discrimination and racism that are, nonetheless very powerful and real, obstacles and burdens. And when SNCC is formed, so the name Coordinating Committee in SNCC suggests there are all these different colleges and college towns which in 1960 have taken up the sit-in movement. So they kind of get together with representatives from each of these groups in 1960 to form this, what's at first thought to be a kind of temporary coordinating committee, but becomes a new organization. So many of the people in SNCC are like Lewis from the South, do have a focus on integration, see the lunch counters sit-ins as very significant. There are others, particularly a group from Howard University in Washington, D.C., many of whom are Northerners, who have a rather different ideological focus.
Wait, can I share a quote from the book? You write, so this was in 1961 at a Nashville symposium, page 97. You write, as the summer went on, Lewis realized he was observing an emerging split within the movement, much more significant than the one between direct action and voter registration. The deeper rift lay between those who placed the principles of King and Lawson at the heart of their vision and those who never quite accepted Gandhian precepts and were ready to try other methods. Astutely, Lewis also recognized that the differences were in part regional in nature.
Right.
Lawson's approach resonated with blacks from the South who were literally fighting for their freedom. Blacks from northern cities tended to downplay desegregation as merely fighting for a hamburger, and instead emphasized addressing deep-seated economic inequalities. Now, this perspective was from Lewis's autobiography,
right? To
be clear, But yeah, I just wanted to read that.
Yeah, and Lewis said that in other oral histories, and he really did see. The other difference, I would say, that's a part of this split is a lot of these Southerners tend to be very religious and church-oriented, and were tutored by ministers like King and Kelly Miller Smith, who led the Nashville group along with James Lawson. And the Howard guys, there was much less of a religious focus. Many were, secular, perhaps atheist, kind of saw, you might even say a Marxian analysis, or at least about power and systems. So there was that intellectual or ideological difference too. Now, for many years, this is 61, Lewis identifies this split, but Lewis as chairman, and actually more important, the executive director, a guy named James Foreman, whose sympathies are probably more with the Carmichael camp, but Foreman understands that he's got to hold SNCC together. It's a diverse group with a lot of different impulses. And they're very successful at muting those differences enough to, push for all these campaigns, whether it's in rural Georgia, they've got an Arkansas project. The Mississippi project of 1964 is very famous, the summer when there's all this voter organizing that leads to a challenge at the Democratic Convention of the racist segregated Mississippi delegation. So it holds together, quite amazingly, despite these differences. But I think what happens is after you get the Civil Rights Act passed, and then after you get the Voting Rights Act passed, the whole thing opens up.
Yeah.
Because it's, okay, now what do we do? And it's now you kind of can't avoid these divisions and these questions. Plus, it's getting to be the 60s. I mean, we know how it is in our own time. Problems, polarization, conflicts that begin say in 2016, like they worsen over time. And at a certain point, you feel like you're at a breaking point. And so by 1965, 1966, SNCC is at a breaking point.
Yeah.
And probably whatever happened in this infamous election night, it would have broken apart. You know? But the election night story, again, it's in the book at greater length, but it's a fascinating story because Lewis feels like the mood of the 60s, the mood of SNCC is shifting away from nonviolence and King, and there's actually now a lot of hostility to Martin Luther King.
Because again, not everybody wants to get their head cracked open.
Right, exactly. And who can blame them?
They're going to fight
frankly?
back.
Yeah.
Some people, Yeah.
And I interviewed one woman from SNCC who in like 2020 or 2022, whenever I interviewed her, said, Martin Luther King, that conniving son of a bitch. Like, she was full of such anger and dislike of Martin Luther King. I was astounded that, 60 years later, it was still so raw. Going back to the time, because a lot of these SNCC people felt King was too accommodationist. We talked about like working with the establishment.
Yeah.
Those questions start to come on the table. Lyndon Johnson is having this White House conference on civil rights. This is where Randolph talks about the freedom budget. Should SNCC be a part of that? Should they try to influence White House policy? Or should they stay on the outside and say, F the establishment, we don't want anything to do with Lyndon Johnson as of the White House? These are questions that I think all movements face. There's a case for fighting from the outside. There's a case for going on the inside and trying to change from the inside. So these divisions lead to an election for chairman where Lewis decides, I'm going to run one more time, try to keep SNCC on this path that I really believe in. To the depth of his soul, he believes in it. He's actually, sort of to his surprise, reelected after a lot of contentious argument by a pretty healthy margin. And then people go off to their bunks. It's at a retreat where they've been for a week outside of Nashville. People retire for the night. And later in the night, a few people in the other camp kind of reopen the question. And they say, how did John Lewis get reelected? We didn't agree to this. And although it seems to be against the SNCC Constitution or bylaws, but these things were never really followed, they hold a new election. And all the grievances toward John Lewis come pouring forth, that he was too pro Lyndon Johnson, that he was too pro King, that he was too churchy, that he was, that he marched at Selma on the bridge because SNCC had voted not to march. And Lewis said, well, I want to march as an individual, not as chairman of SNCC. All these things, and Carmichael is elected. So it's very disillusioning. Lewis decides to remain in SNCC, but after a couple of months, he sees enough signs that he's not really welcome. It's not the organization it used to be, and he leaves. So that's sort of the context for this split. And this becomes a real debate, among Black Americans, among Americans in general, about whether, Carmichael's radical path of a more militant approach, a more separatist approach, call it what you will, Black nationalist, versus a more integrationist vision, the King, Bayard Rustin vision of an interracial coalition. Which of these will best serve Black Americans? And it's a debate, I think, that, has returned today in some ways.
Yeah, let me ask you that, because this was the part of the book where things started to get a little sticky for me, right? And I guess my question at the core of that is, in your reporting, in your conversations, how much of a sense of struggle did you get from Lewis as it related to the limits of nonviolence and integration? Because I think what makes the perspectives of Stokely Carmichael so attractive these days is because there's a lot of evidence to show that integration didn't really work like the way we had hoped, and nonviolence only goes so far. I'm not trying to get beat up for rights, you know? Like, how did he grapple with that?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think he did reflect on it and think about it and grapple with it. You know, there's one speech actually the previous year. So in 1965, he kind of sees the handwriting on the wall then. And he decides then, you know, to run for re-election. That time he wins. But he wins in part because he gives a speech that really makes a lot of concessions to, they're not using the phrase Black Power yet, but to that wing of SNCC. He talks about a book that I hadn't known, but I looked up, called A Different Drummer by Melvin Kelly, a Black novelist. I think I've got the name right. Who talks about just how whites can never really understand the experience of being Black. And it's a book, and it's a sensibility in this speech that Lewis gives that pays much more respect to those arguments and to those viewpoints. And yet he can never give up his belief both in nonviolence, but also, and again, I think it's rooted in both his Christianity and what we might call a kind of liberal universalism, that ultimately we are all human and we are all the same in that fundamental sense. And so he never wants to give up on the interracial vision. I'll just say one other little fascinating thing I learned about this in the research. Some of these groups that formed SNCC were largely or entirely Black. The Nashville group was from the beginning integrated. And it's because, or one of the main reasons is because Fisk University, which is a great HBCU in Nashville, had a program where whites would come as like visiting students or exchange students. And you'd have a college student from Indiana or California spend a semester or a year at Fisk. And many of them, like if you think about, well, what's the type of white kid who wants to spend a semester at Fisk, are then kind of drawn into the movement because they see this as fighting for something they are already instinctively believing in. Mm-hmm. So that group under James Lawson and Kelly Miller Smith in Nashville is integrated from the beginning. And John Lewis has a lot of white comrades, allies, friends whose commitment to, you know, his freedom and his equality, you know, impress him very deeply. So he never wants to give up on this. I mean, I'll tell one more quick story. At one time, there's a conference at Howard, a SNCC conference that's held at Howard shortly after Kennedy's assassination. And again, some of the Black Power stuff's already emerging. And Lewis is walking with a few Black friends and one white friend named Danny Lyon, who's a Jewish kid from Queens, who goes on to be a very famous and distinguished photographer and does a lot of amazing photography.
He shot the Selma photo, am I correct?
I don't think he shot that one, okay. But there are many famous, he might have shot the March on Washington one. Many famous images. Perhaps the best known one is you see John Lewis at age 21 with two young people kneeling before a brick wall, and it was made into a SNCC poster that says, "Come, let us build a better world together." And, you know, it became a poster that was on dorm room walls. Anyway, he's with Danny and he's with a few of the other Black SNCC guys. They go into this, you know, approach this kind of Black nationalist conference or get together. There's a table out front, and it has some of Danny Lyon's photos, like in the literature. And the guy says at the desk, says, "He can't come in," like in the third person, referring to Danny Lyon. And Danny says, "Those are my photos. You know, I'm part of the movement." And they say, "He can't come in." Some of the other guys go walk on in. John Lewis turns on a dime and walks out with Danny Lyon. And he says, "You know, I know what it's like to be kept out of some place because of my skin color." Now, of course, he didn't believe that it was exactly a symmetrical situation. He understood discrimination against blacks was different from that kind of discrimination against whites, but he also understood what was similar about the experience. And
he was also loyal to his friend, right?
He was loyal to his friend, but it was also, I think, that experience of, there came a point in SNCC after John Lewis quit where it was, should we just kick out all the white people? And eventually they did, although only like 17 people were left in SNCC at that point voting. Like it was kind of a rump of the organization. But he really just didn't believe that, that was what you should do. He said the movement, SNCC and the civil rights movement, should be black-led and should focus on black interests and goals, but it should be an interracial movement. And that was just, I think, a fundamental difference in how he and some of his friends and colleagues saw the world.
Yeah. We are way past time,
okay.
but I have 2 more questions. If I could just squeeze 2 more
All right.
in there.
Well, as long as people aren't heading for the exit.
Is everybody all right? Everybody good? Hell, I might get asked 3 more questions. I want to ask you this. We've talked a lot about Lewis, and we've kind of touched on how some of his convictions could be a flaw in a sense, right? We just talked about him being voted out of his chairmanship at SNCC. And some of the things people said that night were criticisms that seemed to pop up again and again in the book.
Yeah.
And there was one that you wrote that stuck out to me that I feel like kind of hit the nail on the head. This came after he was in Congress. This was in reaction to his book, Walking with the Wind.
Right.
Broadly, there was a positive reception, but people close to him were not really feeling it that much. And here's one of the things. You write, this came from Muriel Tillinghast.
Muriel Tillinghast.
She was a friend of Lewis from SNCC. She considered him a decent person, but that his goal became to stay in office, which is the agenda that most politicians have. Once he was in office, he turned his back on SNCC. He was unwilling to acknowledge SNCC. I never really forgave John for that. And this is the line where I said, that's hitting something. His life bears out the detriment of getting involved in politics from the inside. That resonated with me because I think the thing that I struggled with towards the later chapters of the book was like, why would a guy like John Lewis, why would a guy who participated in the civil rights movement, who fought the establishment, got a win on the establishment, join the establishment, right?
Right.
And because I feel like somebody like that is bigger than the establishment, at least big enough to fight it. I wonder how that struck you as an observer when you read that and you read the other criticisms. There was some other ones. There was a mean one in 2008, I think, with Obama. But how did those criticisms hit you as an observer of his life?
Right. And I'll just tell them so it's not to tease. 2008, Lewis had endorsed Hillary Clinton after much agony over Barack Obama. But then after Obama won first the Iowa caucus, but then more important, Georgia, Lewis was coming under all this pressure to flip his endorsement. And there was a gathering of kind of young local activists who were pro-Obama.
Jelani Cobb was
Jelani Cobb, who's now writes for The New Yorker, well-known journalist and historian, told me this story. He was at the meeting, and he was sort of part of this group, although he didn't endorse this comment. He said somebody at the meeting said, John Lewis stood up to white people at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and that was the last time he did so. So, look, there were people who felt this way, people from SNCC and other people of a more radical politics. In a way, I think it sort of depends on where you sit and where your own politics are. I think John Lewis would say, coming out of the 60s and going into the 70s, the sense of opportunity of blacks running for office, of taking power, of holding power, whether it was as mayor, city councilman, sheriff. I mean, John Lewis loved the fact that Selma, which had had this brutal sheriff, Jim Clark, he's notorious in the history books. Now all these years later, it was a guy named, I think, John Hewlett, who was one of the local Selma activists who became sheriff. And, he just thought, this is what we have to do. We have to take back. You talk about black power. Yeah, let's have power as a congressman, as a president. And of course, there's also a perspective that, well, it's a kind of power, but you're trimming your sails and you have to make compromises, and maybe these are intolerable compromises. I mean, I think Lewis struggled. I think he knew sometimes he had to go along with things he didn't like. I think he tried to, as he would say, keep your eyes on the prize, to keep in view the principles and the goals. And he, I think he would reject the notion that he was only trying to stay in power. And I think his constituents, by virtue of reelecting him, must have felt he was doing something for them. And he actually was quite good at constituent services, and he helped Atlanta become a booming metropolis, and helping its transportation and revitalizing the old Sweet Auburn historic district of Kingsholm, and a lot of things like that. But I think some of these criticisms put their finger, I would say, not so much on John Lewis, but on the dilemma of, do you work from the inside or the outside? Mm-hmm. I mean, my own view is, what's pretty amazing about John Lewis is that most of us, like, if we're lucky, can make a small mark in one arena in our lifetimes. John Lewis managed to succeed in protest, and then managed to succeed in politics, and in two arenas which kind of overlap, but in some ways are quite different. He managed to be, remarkably effective and even transformational. Mm-hmm. And that ability to sort of move, to bring the sensibility of a protester into politics, and to demonstrate a certain, as we said with March on Washington, a certain political savvy, even when he's at the height of his protest years, I think speak well of the man. But I insisted on including in the book these criticisms, because I think they are real criticisms that a number of people make. And I didn't want to write a hagiography. I wanted people to understand he had critics from the right. He had critics from the left. People on the right thought he was too partisan a Democrat. People on the left thought he was too in bed with the establishment. But he persevered. Mm-hmm.
Well, for the last question, I have to ask this as we wrap. John Lewis passed in 2020 before a Biden presidency that is coming to a close. One of his big worries was Donald Trump, and we are about to enter another Trump presidency.
Yeah.
Something he said, because Trump was the only president that John Lewis called a racist. And he came in under Reagan. I thought that was interesting. I said, okay.
Well, he was not a fan of Reagan, but I never found him explicitly calling him a racist.
Yeah. You said that he said he doesn't understand the significance of civil rights. And so I would like to know, as we prepare for this Trump presidency, what purpose do you want this book to serve in this moment and in the moments moving forward?
Yeah. Well, look, as a historian, a writer, biographer, I had a goal that was not utilitarian or political. My goal was sort of to try to do justice to the life of John Lewis, to tell a man's life and the history well and truly in a way that people could learn and appreciate. That said, I do find myself kind of turning to the book, and particularly that chapter on the first Trump term and John Lewis's role for, I don't know, maybe comfort or solace or hope or inspiration. He did, I mean, he was already emerging as kind of this celebrity hero before Trump's election. But it was actually in those years, and I think the thing that kind of certified his iconhood was that he became like the anti-Trump, this antidote to Trump. There's a story right after Trump's election in 2016, and this came from, I think, a Washington Post account, but a woman is walking through the Atlanta airport just beside herself, despondent. I think probably like a lot of us couldn't sleep, waking up at odd hours, just feeling sick about Trump's election. And she sees, and he was often in the Atlanta airport, John Lewis getting a shoe shine. And John Lewis steps off the pedestal, and he comes over and he gives this woman a hug. And she tells the reporter, I felt I was going to be all right, that we were going to make it through these 4 years, or I forget her exact words. And I think Lewis, not just because of his belief in forgiveness and redemption, but also because he embodied the best of our democratic traditions and the idea that you could triumph over adversity. I think it's safe to say the adversity of Jim Crow Alabama in 1940 or 1950 was worse than even a Trump presidency. And
for some,
right? For some, I mean, certainly for people like John Lewis. And so, the fact that we could make that progress, and Lewis was always a believer in progress. He was not given to pessimism. There's actually one funny story where in 1994, after the Republicans take the Congress, one of his aides they called it the tsunami when the Republicans won the Congress for the first time in 40 years. She comes to him knowing that he's always buoyant and optimistic and says, Mr. Lewis, please tell me there's a silver lining. And he says, Debbie, there is no silver lining. But within a week or two, he was back to rallying the Democrats. He became one of the lead fighters against Newt Gingrich, helping raise questions about all his ethics violations, and really, in some ways, trimming Gingrich's sails and limiting the damage he could do as Speaker. And I think he played a similar role, maybe not legislatively in the Trump years, but as a symbol for people to turn to for hope and perseverance. And he's not with us now, but if the book and if reading about and learning about the life of John Lewis today can provide some measure of that kind of hope and willingness to fight on and persevere, I would not be unhappy.
Well, David, the book is definitely a wonderful walk through history. Thank you so much for this work. Thank you for coming through the CitySpace to talk to us.
Thank you, Darryl. This has been a terrific conversation.
Yeah.